Good morning, students. I hope you're doing well. Prateek, if I'm audible, please let me know. Good morning. Right. So, in our previous lecture, we had discussed the Surat split of 1907. Now, a few short notes about it. Okay. So, you can begin by writing a short introduction. Write down. The Surat split refers to the the expulsion of the extremists from the Congress at its Surat session in 1907. Full stop. It gave a death blow to the Swadeshi movement and slowed down the national movement as a whole. Full stop. Superficially, comma, this development seems surprising, but closer observation reveals that it was largely inevitable. Full stop. Next point. The Surat split was simply the physical manifestation of the ideological division of the Congress. Full stop. It was bound to happen sooner or later. Full stop. It was the pressure created by the Swadeshi movement that brought about the split in 1907. ठीक है? Next subheading लिखो. Factors behind the Surat split. Number one, ideological differences between the moderates and extremists. Ideological differences between the moderates and extremists. Write down इसमें. The moderates and extremists had a wide ideological gulf dividing them. Full stop. Their opinions differed on almost all issues or almost all questions pertaining to the national struggle. Pertaining, P-E-R-T-A-I-N-I-N-G, pertaining to the national struggle. Full stop. These include A, B, C. A, methods. कोलन करके लिखो. Moderates wanted to stick to constitutional methods. While extremists favored passive resistance involving the masses. B, objectives. Moderates simply wanted the annulment of partition along with incremental constitutional reforms. Whereas the extremists wanted Swaraj. C, scope and extent of the movement. Scope and extent of the movement. Moderates wanted to keep the movement confined to Bengal, while the extremists wanted to spread it across India. Full stop. Same point में continue. Similarly, The moderates supported only the idea of an economic boycott, while the extremists wanted to extend boycott to the level of general non-cooperation with the British rule. Okay? This is one factor, ideological differences between moderates and extremists. Number 2 लिखो. The numerical disparity between the moderates and extremists लिखो under this. While the moderates had a majority of numbers within the Congress, comma, the extremists enjoyed much higher popularity among the masses. Much higher popularity among the masses. Full stop. The Swadeshi movement being an extremist-led movement frustrated the moderates and was bound to cause friction. Full stop. The moderates used their numerical advantage to slow down the movement, and this caused suspicion in the minds of the extremists. Okay? So this was another factor, that while the extremists were in the driving seat, it was the moderates who were actually applying the brakes. Okay? So cohesion nahi tha, there was great degree of friction. And this also aggravated the personal and professional rivalries between the two factions. Write down. Number 3. increasing and open hostility between the moderates and extremists. Between the moderates and extremists. Full stop. The extremists used their public platform not only to condemn British misrule, but also to paint British misrule, but also to paint the moderates as loyalist, unpatriotic, political mendicants. Political mendicants. Full stop. Subpoint. Aurobindo Ghosh published a series of essays titled New Lamps for the Old. New Lamps for the Old, which criticized in a bitter and sarcastic fashion. In a bitter and sarcastic fashion. Comma, not only the moderate method, but also the moderate leadership personally. But also the moderate leadership personally. ठीक है. Next point. Naturally, this caused personal rancor. Personal rancor. RANCOUR. Personal rancor. This caused personal R. रैंकर का मतलब होता है जनरल फीलिंग ऑफ इल विल, फ्यूड. ठीक है. पर्सनल रैंकर बिटवीन द टू फैक्शंस. Naturally, this caused personal rancor between the two factions. And the relationship suffered grievously. Comma, gradually reaching the breaking point. Right? Now, one aspect of this was that जो भी थोड़ा बहुत possibility of compromise बचा हुआ था moderates और extremists के बीच में, that also evaporated. So, as a result, while their ideological positions were very different, there may have been a possibility of some kind of compromise, जो कि हमें 1906 में देखने के लिए भी मिला था. But with the passage of time, because of growing hostility, now both the positions, both the groups became adamant on their version of nationalism. दूसरे की बात सुनना छोड़ दिया था. Right? Write down. Next sub point. This growing hostility ended any hopes for a future compromise, as both groups became increasingly adamant. Full stop. Next main point लिखो. These weaknesses were exploited by the British to bring about the Surat split. Next subheading दो. Build up towards the Surat split. देखो. To appreciate the events at Surat, in December 1907, we must go back all the way to the beginning of the Swadeshi movement. Since this created a domino effect which would ultimately destroy the Congress's unity. A. Banaras Session 1905, Gopal Krishna Gokhale. Write down. The movement had started in August 1905 and was still gaining momentum when the 1905 session took place. Full stop. Next sub point. The moderates used their numerical advantage to try and retard the movement. To try and retard the movement. Next sub point. Under Gokhale's presidency, comma, the Congress adopted mild resolutions condemning the partition of Bengal, and calling for a limited program of economic boycott within Bengal. Full stop. Next sub point. This frustrated the extremists greatly. Who wanted to control the Congress agenda and wield it, W-E-I-L-D, wield it as a weapon in the Swadeshi movement. And this is what exactly the moderates were trying to prevent. They did not wanted the Congress to be taken over by the extremists. दोनों के बीच में suspicions और frustrations बढ़ रहे हैं. B. Calcutta session. (1906). दादा भाई नारोजी. लिखिए. During 1906, comma, the Swadeshi movement had emerged as a powerful all India mass movement. Full stop. Next point. The national movement as a whole had perceptibly slipped out of the moderate grasp. And the extremists had an upper hand. ठीक है, मॉडरेट्स को सबसे बड़ा डर क्या था? That if they do not accept some of the demands of the extremists, then they are going to become permanently irrelevant. And with their irrelevance, the Congress is also going to lose relevance, since it was an institution dominated by the moderates numerically. ठीक है, तो वही आर्गुमेंट है जो अभी जैसे G4 वाले ग्रुप्स यूएन के लिए देते हैं कि इसमें जो गवर्नेंस स्ट्रक्चर है उसको रिफॉर्म करने की जरूरत है, अदरवाइज it will lose all relevance in global governance, and because it will not reflect the reality of the ground level. So moderates were feeling intense pressure to respond to the enthusiastic and emboldened agenda of the extremists. Write down. Next subpoint. The moderates felt increasing pressure to respond to the extremists, to respond to the extremist agenda, to respond to the extremist agenda in a positive manner, in a positive manner. Full stop. Next point. As a compromise, comma, Dada Bhai Naroji who was respected by both sides, comma, was elected as president in place of Bal Gangadhar Tilak और लाला लाजपत राय. बाल गंगाधर तिलक और लाला लाजपत राय, comma, who the extremists wanted, who the extremists wanted. Full stop. In return, comma, the Congress adopted a more radical stance towards the British, with 4 resolutions. क्या है ये? बताओ. स्वराज, स्वदेशी, boycott and national education. A, स्वराज लिखो इसमें. The Congress officially raised the demand of Swaraj for the first time. full stop. While it was generally understood, while it was generally understood as, within quotes, self rule within British rule or within the British Empire, within the British Empire, close quotes, like the white colonies of Canada and Australia, comma, it was not clearly defined. It was not clearly defined. ठीक है? That means कि what स्वराज is going to entail, इसको कभी clearly define नहीं किया गया. And what was the result of this vagueness? That different sections are going to continue interpreting it in their own manner. तो जो ज्यादा radical लोग होंगे such as औरबिंदो घोष, वो क्या बोलेंगे? स्वराज का मतलब होता है पूर्ण स्वराज. Whereas the moderate leaders, they are going to consider Swaraj to be simply responsible government within British rule. ठीक है? So write down this vagueness. This same point में ही, this vagueness resulted in the emergence of radically differing opinions or radically differing interpretations. Radically differing interpretations. And what is going to be the result of this? Since this was the central demand of the Congress now officially, इसका actual meaning बहुत important हो गया था. And this is going to lead to greater friction between the two extreme ends of the political spectrum. तो अब ये दोनों लोग इस बात पे भी लड़ने लग जाएंगे कि स्वराज का actual meaning क्या है. Write down. This caused even greater friction between the moderates and extremists. Next लिखो B, Swadeshi. The Congress adopted Swadeshi as the means to attain Swaraj. Means to attain Swaraj. Full stop. बट यहाँ पे भी डिफरेंस था. मॉडरेट्स के लिए स्वदेशी का मतलब क्या हुआ? केवल इकोनॉमिक सेल्फ सफिशिएंसी. whereas extremists के लिए political, social, economic as well as cultural self-sufficiency. ठीक है? So while the moderate version of Swadeshi was limited only to the setting up of Swadeshi enterprises and businesses, for the extremists it was complete decolonization of the Indian society and culture. इंडिया को ये intellectually, ideologically liberate करना चाहते थे from the hold of colonialism. ठीक है? Whereas the moderates would never agree to this. उनके लिए Western civilization was the pinnacle of human existence. They saw the Indian civilization quite as a broken one in need of much reform. तो उनके लिए British presence India में, British सोसाइटी और सिविलाइजेशन का इन्फ्लुएंस दैट वाज क्रूशियल टू मॉडर्नाइज इंडिया. एक्सट्रीमिस्ट बोलते थे कि हमें ये कुछ नहीं चाहिए. ठीक है, राइट डाउन. For the moderates, it meant the promotion of Swadeshi economic enterprises only. It meant the promotion of Swadeshi economic enterprises only. Full stop. On the other hand, the extremists supported a more comprehensive version involving political, economic, comprehensive version involving political, economic, social, cultural, and psychological self-sufficiency. ठीक है. Essentially, they wanted the complete decolonization of India and the uprooting of Western influence. And the uprooting of Western influence. Clear? Next, C. Boycott. Now, in 1906, the moderates had to accept the extremist version of boycott. They had to agree that boycott would involve the boycott of not only British goods but even British institutions. That means they had to accept the version of non-cooperation with British rule that was being pushed by the extremists. Did they do this willingly or under pressure? Under pressure. So once again, यहाँ पे भी जो compromise है that is taking place under duress. Willingly नहीं आ रहा. ठीक है? Write down. The Congress resolved to boycott not only British goods but also British institutions and services. Also British institutions and services such as schools, services such as schools, colleges, law courts, legislatures, and councils. Sub point लिखो. However, this was a bitter pill for the moderates to swallow. This was a bitter pill for the moderates to swallow. ठीक है, एंड डी लिखो नेशनल एजुकेशन, national education. Write down. The Congress resolved. The Congress resolved to promote national education involving both literary and technical education in the vernacular medium. In the vernacular medium. ठीक है, full stop. Its objective was to liberate India from the ideological domination of British rule and inspire cultural pride and nationalism. Full stop. सब point. But यहाँ पे दिक्कत क्या था? The moderates once again were admirers of Western English education. यहाँ पर जो education है that would be promoted through the vernacular medium instead of Western philosophy. Indian philosophy and culture का यहाँ पे ज़्यादा domination होगा. So this was also something the moderates had to accept under pressure. Write down. Once again, the moderates felt arm twisted. The moderates felt arm twisted. ठीक है? So these were the developments during the 1906 session at Calcutta under the presidency of Dadabhai Naoroji. फिर लिखो सूरत सेशन 1907 राज बिहारी घोष. Raj Bihari Ghosh. Write down. During 1906-1907, comma, new developments had taken place which shifted the nature of political discourse and brought about the split Full stop. These included A, B, and C. A, the meeting of Gokhale with Montague, 1906. Gokhale traveled to Britain. Same point में लिखो. Gokhale traveled to Britain at the invitation of the Secretary of State. At the invitation of the Secretary of State for India. This Lord Montague, ठीक है? At the invitation of the Secretary of State for India. Full stop. He was assured of constitutional reforms if the moderates withdrew their support for the Swadeshi movement. ठीक है? Next लिखो. Shimla deputation and formation of the Muslim League, 1906. Write down. The creation of the Muslim League. And the demand for separate electorates had exposed chinks in the armor, CHINKS, chinks in the armor of Indian nationalism and Indian nationalism in the armor of Indian nationalism and strengthened the anti-extremist alliance. Strengthened the anti-extremist alliance. Okay? Why are we saying this? Because while the extremists wanted annulment of partition of Bengal, the Muslim League leaders wanted the continuation of the partition of Bengal. Okay? And since they were closer to the moderates, क्योंकि वो भी loyalist थे, ये भी loyalist थे, a partnership of convenience emerged between the two of them. ठीक है? दोनों का common enemy कौन होगा? The extremists. And C लिखो. The arrest and deportation of Ajit Singh and exile of Lala Lajpat Rai. 1907. Write down. The government cracked down. The government cracked down in Punjab. In Punjab was meant to rattle the moderates. Was meant to rattle the moderates. RATTLE. Rattle the moderates. मतलब उनको हिलाने के लिए. ठीक है. Rattle the moderates into quickly disavowing political extremism and the demand for Swaraj. ठीक है. तो पॉइंट नंबर ए जो है, मीटिंग ऑफ गोखले विद मॉन्टेग्यू, दैट वाज मेंट टू एक्ट एज द कैरेट, and this arrest and deportation of Ajit Singh, exile of Lala Lajpat Rai, this was meant to act as the stick. ठीक है. तो नेक्स्ट लिखो, नेक्स्ट पॉइंट. ड्यू टू दीज, नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट, ड्यू टू दीज comma, the moderates were anxious to distance themselves from the extremists. To distance themselves from the extremists and roll back the movement. And roll back the movement. ठीक है. Is this clear? Full stop. On the other hand, comma, the extremists were becoming even more radical, with Aurobindo Ghosh floating the idea, of complete independence and mass civil disobedience. Complete independence and mass civil disobedience. Next main point. Once again, the extremists wanted either Tilak or Lala Lajpat Rai, to be president. Full stop. The latter was eliminated by exile. While the former was eliminated by organizing the session at Surat of Surat, which was in Tilak's native province of Bombay, instead of Nagpur, native province of Bombay, instead of Nagpur, within brackets, CP, as the extremists had been demanding. As the extremists had been demanding. Okay? So both the extremist candidates stood eliminated. They could not be president. Next main point likho. The two sides met at Surat in a charged atmosphere. Met at Surat. The two sides met at Surat in a charged atmosphere. In a charged atmosphere. Full stop. The moderates elected Raj Bihari Ghosh and quickly resolved to withdraw the four resolutions of 1906. The four resolutions of 1906. याद है ना? स्वराज, स्वदेशी, बॉयकॉट एंड नेशनल एजुकेशन वाले जो रेजोल्यूशंस थे उनको विड्रॉ करने के लिए मूव कर दिया गया. नेक्स्ट पॉइंट. This caused the outbreak of physical violence following which the police was called in to physically expel the extremists. To physically expel the extremists. Full stop. After this, comma, the moderates passed a resolution permanently expelling the extremists from Congress. Full stop. For this, amendments were made to the Congress Constitution. Amendments were made to the Congress Constitution, which made their re-entry virtually impossible if the moderates did not wish so. तो मॉडरेट्स की सहमति के बिना कोई भी एक्सट्रीमिस्ट लीडर वापस कांग्रेस के अंदर नहीं आ सकता है, if the moderates did not wish so. ठीक है, so this was the build up to the Surat split. Next लिखो, the government approach. Government approach. ठीक है, write down. The beginning of the Swadeshi movement and its popularity alarmed the British. The beginning of the Swadeshi movement and its popularity alarmed the British. Full stop. Their tried and tested policy of divide and rule had backfired. Their tried and tested policy of divide and rule had backfired. किस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में हम बोल रहे हैं इसको? कब लगाया उन्होंने डिवाइड एंड रूल? While partitioning Bengal, their main objective was to weaken Indian nationalism, but इसका बिल्कुल उल्टा हुआ है. It rather resulted in strengthening Indian nationalism and transformed its nature, its attitude also. अब mass struggle का phase शुरू हो गया था. Next sub point, next main point. The British were desperately searching for an alternative approach. Searching for an alternative approach. Full stop. The ideological differences within the Congress exposed it. Full stop. The British, wanting to capitalize, adopted the carrot and stick policy. The carrot and stick policy. That was to be implemented, the carrot and stick policy, that was to be implemented in 3 stages. In 3 stages. A. Mild repression. Mild repression. लिखो. The British mildly repressed the extremist movement in Punjab. Full stop. This was done primarily to terrify the moderates, B, conciliation, write down, the moderates were conciliated through indications of upcoming liberal reforms if they distance themselves from the extremists. C, isolation and suppression. Full stop. Once the moderates withdrew their support of the Swadeshi movement, the extremists would become isolated and the British could ruthlessly suppress the movement without any resistance. The movement without any resistance. ठीक है, नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट लिखो, the carrot and stick approach succeeded where the divide and rule policy had failed. Full stop. The Swadeshi movement was left leaderless following the large-scale arrest of extremist leaders. Arrest of extremist leaders. Large-scale arrest of extremist leaders. Full stop. Next point. The moderates did not try to defend the extremists, comma, resulting in stiff sentences, stiff sentences and mass deportations, and mass deportations. Full stop. Subpoint. Tilak was deported to Mandalay for 6 years, while Aurobindo Ghosh, was forced to retire, from active politics, was forced to retire from active politics. Full stop. Next subpoint. Sorry, next main point. The Surat split thus directly caused the demise of the Swadeshi movement. Full stop. Next main point. Further, Indian nationalism was pushed into a lengthy phase of dormancy. So not only did the Surat split gave a death blow to the Swadeshi movement, it also gave a body blow to the national movement as a whole. Following the Surat split, no mass movement could be launched up to 1916. And during this period, the moderates, who were now the only political force within the Congress, they were unable to exert any real pressure on the British. The British continued to do what they wanted. Moderates को उन्होंने respond किया only in the form of lip service, and the moderates did not have the political strength to challenge the British misrule any further. Because while the moderates may have been the shield of Indian nationalism, it was definitely the extremists who were the sword of Indian nationalism. ठीक है, so जब तक तलवार और ढाल एक साथ कोऑर्डिनेशन में नहीं चलेगा, both are going to be left ineffective. ठीक है, without any real bite to the movement. So the national movement as a whole, that was blunted because of the Surat split. तो अभी आपने क्या लिखा है? It pushed the national movement as a whole into a phase of dormancy. Write down. Same point में. While moderates were the shield of the movement, comma, the extremists were its sword, the extremists were its sword. Full stop. Next point. A subpoint. Following the end of the Swadeshi movement, no mass movement was launched for almost a decade. for almost a decade. Next subpoint. With the extremists out of the picture, no mass movement was launched for almost a decade. No mass movement was launched for almost a decade. करीब 10 साल तक कोई मास एक्टिविटी हुई ही नहीं. नेक्स्ट सब पॉइंट. With the extremists out of the picture, with the extremists out of the picture, comma, the British could simply ignore the moderates and progress on nationalist demands remained virtually non-existent. Next main point. The Surat split and the demise of Swadeshi filled the younger nationalists with a sense of disenchantment and despair. Full stop. Subpoint. They drifted apart from both political moderation and extremism. मॉडरेशन, तो मॉडरेट मेथड से भी और एक्सट्रीमिस्ट मेथड से दोनों से ये दूर हो गए. पॉलिटिकल मॉडरेशन एंड एक्सट्रीमिज्म. एंड वेयर डिड दे ड्रिफ्ट टुवर्ड्स? इसकी तरफ गए. इस समय तक गांधी आए थे? नहीं आए थे. सो इसके अलावा और कौन सा मूवमेंट अब शुरू होगा? रेवोल्यूशनरी मूवमेंट. एंड क्या लिखा है अभी आपने? एंड एक्सट्रीमिज्म towards the use of revolutionary methods. ठीक है. Now the emergence of revolutionary extremism हमको डिटेल में अभी आगे कवर करना है. But one of the factors behind the emergence of revolutionary extremism was the failure of the moderates and extremists to come to a common meeting point, because the younger nationalists थे, they were looking at these leaders as their ideals, and their trust in the leadership had been betrayed, that had been broken. So now they were growing increasingly desperate. They were quite patriotic and energetic also, and they wanted a new channel to express their energy, to express their patriotism. Because they were young and inexperienced in politics, they also lacked a true understanding of the nature of British rule. इनको ये लगा कि the British rule in India is simply a collection of individual officials who are keeping Indians oppressed, keeping Indians enslaved. So eliminate the agent, you will eliminate the oppression. They did not understand that these individual officials were simply part of a larger colonial machinery. पूरा एक सिस्टम था. तो जब तक उस सिस्टम को फ्रॉम विद इन एंड विदाउट प्रेशराइज करके ब्रेक नहीं करोगे, तब तक इट इज गोइंग टू कंटिन्यू इट्स ऑपरेसिव एक्सप्लॉयटेशन. The simple elimination of removable and replaceable parts of the machinery is not going to cause its complete breakdown. वो उसको थोड़ी देर के लिए halt कर सकता है, मे बी थोड़ी देर के लिए jolt दे दे, लेकिन complete end नहीं करेगा, right? And because they could not realize this grand design, they acted for individual acts of revolutionary heroism, right? So the Surat split was that thing which triggered the rise of revolutionary extremism. That is the point we are trying to make. ठीक है, इतना क्लियर है? नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट लिखो. The Surat split also imparted a tough lesson to future nationalists. A tough lesson to future nationalists. Tough lesson to future nationalists. Full stop. तो आगे आने वाले जनरेशन ऑफ नेशनलिस्ट को क्या रियलाइजेशन हुआ? That the worst thing that can happen to the national movement is the permanent division or split of the Congress, because that had retarded the progress. It had stopped the national movement dead in its tracks. So कुछ भी हो जाए आगे जाकर के ये नहीं हो सकता है. In the future also, a split like situation did emerge within the Congress on several occasions. The most notable among these were the developments following the withdrawal of the non-cooperation, that is the Swarajist controversy, and the developments within the Congress following the end of the civil disobedience movement, that is the emergence of a new strategic debate within the Congress post civil disobedience movement. On both occasions, the Congress seemed to be on the verge of splitting into two or more factions. But because of the lessons learnt following the aftermath of the Surat split, the Congress leadership was determined not to allow this to happen. It was determined to prevent this. And therefore, a solution was found. A middle path was created on both occasions, thus preserving the unity of the Congress and the unity of the national movement as a whole. Take it, write down. The Congress, some say sub point लिखो. The Congress realized that the split had caused immense damage and was determined to prevent it in the future. Full stop. This determination allowed the Congress leadership to preserve unity during the Swarajist controversy, unity during the Swarajist controversy, 1922-23, and the post CDM strategic debate. And the post CDM strategic debate, 1934 to 37. से 37 क्लियर है? So this is the significance of the Surat split. Take down a question. The carrot and stick policy succeeded where the divide and rule policy had failed. Full stop. In the context of this statement, comma, discuss the significance of the Surat split. Two 200 words. ठीक है? Will you be able to address this? समझ में आया है ना? चलिए, नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन. Discuss the factors responsible for the Surat split. Full stop. How did the split manifest since the beginning of the Swadeshi movement? Two 200 words, 15 marks. We have to discuss the factors for the split and the build up to the split. So how did the split eventually take place? So ये हो गया Surat split. With this we have discussed all the factors responsible for the failure of the Swadeshi. And finally we have to talk about the significance of the Swadeshi movement. बताइए. What is the significance of the Swadeshi movement? In many ways, it marked a new beginning in Indian nationalism. How? It represented the beginning of mass politics. It announced the beginning of the extremist phase of the national movement, permanently ending the leadership of the moderates. It gave to the national movement a new objective, Swaraj, new methods, that is boycott and Swadeshi, passive resistance, new energy, that is a new power, that is it was the first evident expression of anti-colonialism on a large scale in Indian politics. Before this, all nationalist activity was confined within the framework of moderate loyalism. ठीक है? Many of these things would be permanent in nature when we are thinking in the context of the future struggle against colonial rule. So it prepared the template for the future of Indian nationalism. ठीक है? It was acting as a laboratory for testing out these things, the ideal of Swaraj, the method of passive resistance, the tool of mass uprising, or sorry, mass movements, and the ideology of anti colonialism. These were perfected over time by individuals such as Mahatma Gandhi. The Swadeshi movement also yielded a new method of mass mobilization, that is, the use of cultural and religious symbols. Which was a double edged sword. डबल एज सोर्ड क्यों बोल रहे हैं हम इसको? इसका एक बहुत सिग्निफिकेंट एडवांटेज था, दैट इज इट्स रॉ अपील टू द मासेस. कल्चर और रिलीजन के नाम पर करोड़ों लोग सड़कों पे आने के लिए रेडी थे. व्हाट वाज द अदर एंगल, डेंजरस एंगल क्या था? दैट it divided the masses along cultural and religious lines. Since India is a land of diversity, probably this approach was not the most conducive for future integrity. And ये जो method of mass mobilization है, that would be used far more effectively by individuals such as Mahatma Gandhi, who framed his idea of national struggle within the framework of Ram Raj, who used the Khilafat issue to bring crores of Indian Muslims onto the streets for the first time against British rule. But उसके dangers भी apparent. The idea of Ram Rajya per se did not appeal to the religious minorities of India, since it has inherent connotations with ancient Indian Hindu rule, right? That did not appeal to the Muslim masses. Further, the politicization of Indian Muslims on a mass scale for the first time had taken place within the framework of religion. Both the movement as well as the objective was a highly religious one. So उनका political जो डेब्यू हुआ है, और दैट वाज गोइंग हैंड इन हैंड विद देयर कम्युनलाइजेशन. सो कम्युनलाइजेशन में इसका एक बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट रोल होगा. Sixthly, the Swadeshi movement also exposed the internal fissures within the national movement. और ये अलग अलग तरह के डिवाइड्स को एक्सपोज करेगा. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, द आइडियोलॉजिकल डिवाइड बिटवीन moderates and extremists, the communal divide between Hindus and Muslims, the cultural divide between the urban lower middle class and the upper middle class, the linguistic divide between the Marathi speaking nationalists and Bengali speaking nationalists who were quite chauvinistic about their linguistic identity, and the general identity of an India that was unified in its diversity. And all of these were simply wedges which the British could now use to pry the different factions of Indian nationalists apart. They could use these fissures as leverage to divide them further, to carve out small silos within Indian nationalism who would be more interested in competing against each other rather than opposing the British rule. Okay? So, by exposing the internal fissures within the Indian national movement, it exposed it to the British design of divide and rule. And by doing this, it had set the goalpost for future generation of nationalists. For example, Mahatma Gandhi did not perceive the relations between different groups as a conflict. Rather, he proposed the ideas of class cooperation, trusteeship, the ending of untouchability, and finding unity where in the general culture of India as opposed to British civilization, as opposed to British culture. So while the Swadeshi movement had exposed the divided nature of Indian culture and Indian civilization, it also set the objectives for the future generation of nationalists. They would not only have to oppose British rule, but would also have to carry out the much more difficult task of nation building. And this was the result why this was the reason why people such as Mahatma Gandhi adopted this kind of strategy rather than an exclusive strategy. Clear hai? So this is the significance of the Swadeshi movement. लिख लें इसको. Give the heading significance of the Swadeshi movement. Write down. In many ways, comma, the Swadeshi movement represented a new beginning in the national movement or in the nationalist struggle. New beginning in the nationalist struggle. Point wise लिखो. Number 1, it announced the beginning of all India mass politics. All India mass politics. Full stop. In the future, comma, the masses would continue to play a massive role in the national movement. In the national movement. Full stop. Next point, number 2. The Swadeshi movement also marked the beginning of the extremist phase of Indian politics. The extremist phase of Indian politics. Full stop. Leadership permanently slipped out of the grip of moderates. Permanently slipped out. Leadership permanently slipped out of the grip of the moderates. Number 3, the Swadeshi movement gave to Indian nationalism, comma, new demands new energy, new methods, and a new power. And a new power. Full stop. This was due to. This was due to the complete transformation of the the complete transformation of the model of politics brought about by this movement. Characterized by of this movement, characterized by Swaraj, Swadeshi, boycott, passive resistance. Swaraj, Swadeshi, boycott, passive resistance, mass participation, and anti-colonialism. Next, number 4. This movement prepared the template for the future of Indian nationalism. For the future of Indian nationalism. This movement prepared the template for the future of Indian nationalism. Full stop. Subpoint. It acted as a laboratory. For testing out new methods and strategies such as boycott and Swadeshi. With mass support. Full stop. These strategies would be perfected by later nationalists such as Mahatma Gandhi, and be used much more effectively. ठीक है? Number 5. The Swadeshi movement also gave nationalists a new tool for mass mobilization, namely cultural and religious symbols. Namely, cultural and religious symbols. Full stop. This would become a permanent fixture, a permanent fixture of Indian nationalism, of a permanent fixture, FIXTURE, a permanent fixture of Indian nationalism. Full stop. However, it was a double-edged sword. It was a double-edged sword. Subpoint. Its raw appeal, its raw appeal could draw millions to the streets, could draw millions to the streets. But it also contributed to the communalization, contributed to the communalization of Indian politics. Contributed to the communalization of Indian politics. And last 6. Swadeshi also exposed the internal fissures within the national movement, exposing it to the British policy of divide and rule. Of divide and rule. Full stop. These included the deep divides between A, B, C, D. A, moderates and extremists. B, Hindus and Muslims. C, the westernized upper middle class, the westernized upper middle class, and the deeply patriotic lower middle class. And D, linguistic and caste divides. Linguistic and caste divides. Extremist leadership came exclusively from the upper castes. ठीक है, चाहे वो चित्पावन ब्राह्मण्स हों in Maharashtra or the Bhadralok in this Bengal, right? So there was an inherent caste divide also. Secondly, the Marathi and Bengali extremists emphasized upon the linguistic superiority of their particular languages, and that is why they were focusing upon vernacular education, they were talking about the linguistic organization of provinces. लेकिन ऐसा हो सकता है कि एक रीजन में एक डोमिनेंट लैंग्वेज हो लेकिन कई सारी माइनॉरिटी लिंग्विस्टिक कम्युनिटीज भी हो, राइट? सो दिस वुड रिजल्ट इन द सप्रेशन ऑफ द लिंग्विस्टिक डाइवर्सिटी ऑफ दैट पर्टिकुलर रीजन. तो ऐसा नहीं है कि नए वाले बंगाल में या फिर पूरे के पूरे बॉम्बे प्रोविंस में सब कोई बंगाली या मराठी स्पीकर्स थे. बॉम्बे consisted of Gujarati speakers and Sindhi speakers also. But Tilak's brand of Marathi chauvinism alienated the Gujarati and Sindhi speakers, right? So linguistic and caste divides, right? Next point लिखो. Sorry, sub point. Next sub point लिखो. As a result, comma, the future nationalists, comma, particularly Mahatma Gandhi, had to adopt a measured and cautious strategy to simultaneously challenge British rule, and overcome internal divisions among Indians. Full stop. In other words, the national struggle and nation building would have to be carried out hand in hand. Full stop. Next up point. This was why Mahatma Gandhi adopted a strategy that sought to prioritize the primary contradiction between Indian nationalism and British imperialism. Over secondary contradictions within Indian nationalism. Over secondary contradictions within Indian nationalism. Full stop. This strategy resulted in ideas such as class cooperation, trusteeship, anti-untouchability, and emphasis on cultural unity. Emphasis on cultural unity. So the point we are trying to make is that because the Swadeshi movement had created a pressure on the future generation of nationalists such as Mahatma Gandhi to carry out the task of both nation building and national struggle at the same time, इन्होंने क्या किया? इन्होंने बोला that जो प्राइमरी कॉन्ट्रडिक्शन है इंडियन नेशनलिज्म का, दैट इज विद the British imperialism. So the equation is simple. Indians are united against the British. And अगर अपनी टीम को स्ट्रेंथन करना है तो जो सेकेंडरी कॉन्ट्रडिक्शन है, आपस के मतभेद हैं, उनको अंडरमाइन करना है या फिर रिजॉल्व करने की जरूरत है. सो secondary contradictions including things such as the class conflict between workers and industrialists, the class conflict between peasants and zamindars, the communal conflict between Muslims and Hindus, the social conflict between the lower castes and upper castes, the social conflict between women and men. पहले किसको रिजॉल्व करने की जरूरत है, इनको या फिर इसको? पहले प्राइमरी कॉन्ट्रडिक्शन को, प्रायोरिटाइजेशन ऑफ प्राइमरी कॉन्ट्रडिक्शंस ओवर ऑल सेकेंडरी कॉन्ट्रडिक्शंस विद इन इंडियन नेशन. क्या बोला महात्मा गांधी ने? अंग्रेजों को पहले हटा दो, दे आर दी वंस हु आर एक्सप्लॉइटिंग आवर डिविजन्स, दे आर दी वंस हु आर मैग्निफाइंग दिस डिवाइड. दीज आर आर इंटरनल कॉन्ट्रडिक्शंस, इंटरनल डिविजन्स. घर की बात है, आपस में बैठ करके प्यार से सुलझा लेंगे, पहले अंग्रेजों को बाहर निकालना जरूरी है. बट एट द सेम टाइम ही ऑल्सो रियलाइज्ड दैट अगर इन इश्यूज को कंप्लीटली इग्नोर कर दिया जाएगा, then this is going to weaken Indian nationalism as a whole because it is going to leave the disease untreated. Or while the Marxist historians talked about class conflict, Gandhi talked about class cooperation. While the Marxist historians, Marxist scholars talked about a blood revolution, Gandhi talked about trusteeship. While Ambedkar talked about the annihilation of the castes, Gandhi talked about anti-untouchability program within the framework of trusteeship. While communal leaders talked about the cultural diversity and the impossibility of a common nation of Hindus and Muslims, Gandhi emphasized upon cultural unity. Okay? So this is the overall significance of the Swadeshi movement and how the failure of the Swadeshi movement, or how what the Swadeshi movement exposed shaped the future strategy of leaders such as Mahatma Gandhi, who was in the driving seat of the national movement from about 1919 right up to 1947. Therefore, he gave the overall shape to Indian nationalism also, right? So Swadeshi movement का direct effect उतनी देर तक पड़ेगा. Take down a question. Discuss the features of the Swadeshi movement and highlight its significance to the national struggle as a whole. 200 words, 15 marks. Now, fourth point क्या था एक बार जरा लिखा. It prepared the template for the future of Indian nationalism. Sub point में, it acted as a laboratory for testing out new methods. It acted as a laboratory for testing out new methods and strategies such as boycott and Swadeshi with mass support. Laboratory for testing out new methods and strategies such as Swadeshi and boycott with mass support. Full stop. These strategies would be perfected by later nationalists such as Mahatma Gandhi and be used much more effectively. These strategies would be perfected by later nationalists such as Mahatma Gandhi and be used much more effectively. हो गया? All right. Thank you. Now, इस question में you are being asked initially to discuss the features of the Swadeshi movement. तो किन features को आप highlight करोगे? Was it a moderate movement or an extremist movement? Extremist movement. Was it a movement of the masses or a movement of the classes? Masses. Did it involve the use of constitutional methods or extra constitutional methods? Extra constitutional methods. Was its objective radical change or incremental change? Radical change. Was it a regional movement or an all India movement? Was it a minor footnote in Indian history or a trendsetter for the future of national struggle? Was it able to attract the whole of the Indian masses or a section of the Indian masses? A section of the Indian masses. Conspicuous by absence were peasants and Muslims. Was it entirely secular in its approach or did it use certain religious symbols for mass mobilization? Religious symbols for mass mobilization were used. So, the use of some questionable methods of mass mobilization. Was it able to bring about greater unity between different factions of nationalists, or did it end up disuniting the Indian nationalists? So it resulted in the division, or it destroyed the unity of Indian nationalism. ठीक है? And there is going to be a slight overlap between the features and the significance of the movement. तो सिग्निफिकेंस ऑफ द मूवमेंट आपने अभी अभी यहाँ पे फ्रेशली इसको डिस्कस किया है. इन्हीं 6 पॉइंट्स को आपको यहाँ पर लिखना है, क्योंकि बट यहाँ पे वही होगा कि एक्सट्रीमिस्ट मूवमेंट आपने पहले ही मेंशन किया था, यहाँ पे भी मेंशन करेंगे, वर्डिंग चेंज कर दोगे. सो द बिगिनिंग ऑफ द स्वदेशी मूवमेंट मार्क्ड एन एंड ऑफ द मॉडरेट फेज एंड अनाउंस द बिगिनिंग ऑफ द एक्सट्रीमिस्ट फेज. आपने यहाँ पे बोला कि रेडिकल मेथड्स यूज किए गए हैं, रेडिकल डिमांड्स थे, तो ये चीज आप थर्ड पॉइंट में भी यहाँ पे मेंशन कर रहे हो, बट वंस अगेन वर्डिंग आप ऑल्टर कर दोगे, राइट? द सेम थिंग दैट क्वेश्चनेबल मेथड्स ऑफ मास मोबिलाइजेशन exposing the weakness of Indian nationalism, you have also discussed that in the third point, right? That it was a trend setter for future nationalism, you have discussed in the fourth point. So these are things जो आपको थोड़े से फ्रेम करने में अलग करना पड़ेगा, बट सिग्निफिकेंस उसका वही होगा. कुछ आपको अगर ऐड करना है तो एक आध चीजें ऐड कर सकते हो. द स्वदेशी मूवमेंट वाज मच मोर इफेक्टिव देन द मॉडरेट स्ट्रगल फॉर प्रेशराइजिंग द ब्रिटिश रूल. It was due to the pressure exerted by the Swadeshi movement that the British had to finally respond in the shape of the Indian Councils Act 1909 as well as the annulment of partition of Bengal in 1911. ठीक है? So it was much more effective than the moderate phase. वो उसका एक additional significance है. ठीक है? हो जाएगा ये? All right then. Next we have to talk about the Morley Minto reforms. Or the Indian Councils Act 1909. एक गलती हो गई है, ये नाम लिख रहा था तब मुझे रियलाइज हुआ. हाँ, यहाँ पे आपको लिखवाया था ना, मीटिंग ऑफ गोखले विद मॉन्टेग्यू. मॉन्टेग्यू वाज नॉट द सेक्रेटरी ऑफ स्टेट फॉर इंडिया एट दिस पॉइंट ऑफ टाइम, इट वाज मॉर्ले. तो इसको करेक्ट कर लीजिएगा, राइट? एंड दैट इज व्हाई मॉर्ले मिंटो रिफॉर्म्स 1909. Montague was Governor General in, Secretary of State in 1917 to 1919. ठीक है? तो जो मॉन्टेग्यूज डिक्लेरेशन है, मॉन्टफर्ड रिफॉर्म्स हैं, वो उस समय है. यहाँ पे मॉर्ले है. तो नेक्स्ट हमको डिस्कस करना है द इंडियन काउंसिल्स एक्ट और द मॉर्ले मिंटो रिफॉर्म्स. दिस वी आर गोइंग टू डू इन टुमारोज क्लास. ठीक है? तो वंस अगेन सेम टाइम पे 8 बजे क्लास शुरू होगी. कल मिलते हैं. एनी डाउट्स? No doubt. All right then. Thank you for your time. See you guys tomorrow.